Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the sixth episode of the 2022 CGA-IGC podcast series. My name is Dr. Michael Hall. I am the chairman of the Department of Clinical Genetics at Fox Chase Cancer Center, and I served as the 2019 president of the CGA-IGC. Today, we're going to have an old-time debate between two incredible experts in the field. That debate's title is called, "Is it time for universal germline genetic testing for all GI cancers?" We have two incredibly knowledgeable experts in the field today and two of my absolute favorite people to lead this debate. The first debater is Heather Hampel. Ms. Hampel is a professor in the Department of Medical Oncology and Therapeutics Research and associate director of the Division of Cancer Genomics at the City of Hope National Cancer Center. She was the CGA 2018 president. Her research focuses on Lynch syndrome and universal tumor screening for Lynch syndrome. She has over 170 publications on the prevalence of Lynch syndrome among colorectal and endometrial cancer patients, the best testing protocols, cost effectiveness, and referral guidelines for cancer genetics. She is a leader in the field of genetic counseling and hereditary cancer research. Welcome, Heather. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Our other debater today is well known to everyone here as well. This is Dr. Matt Yurgelun. Matt Yurgelun is a gastrointestinal medical oncologist, senior physician, and assistant professor of medicine at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in the Gastrointestinal Cancer Center and the Division of Cancer Genetics and Prevention. Matt also served as the CGA 2020 president. He has served as the director of the Dana-Farber Lynch Syndrome Center since its launch in 2019. His clinical interests include gastrointestinal cancers and genetic testing and management of hereditary GI cancer syndromes. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I've already introduced our subject today and our format. We're going to actually start with just a little bit of a quick overview of the field presented by our two debaters before we actually get into the meat of our opinions. So I've prepared actually just a few questions to ask each of our guests about where we are in the state of genetic testing in GI cancers today. So I'm going to start with Dr. Yurgelun. I wanted to ask you, Matt, if you can just first discuss a little bit of just the scope generally of genetic testing in GI cancers today.
Yeah, so this has really been a moving target, and I'm sure will remain a moving target. I think back when most of us started in this field, because it wasn't that long ago, a lot of what we've been doing has been syndrome-specific germline testing. An individual or a family meets specific criteria for a given syndrome, such as, say, Lynch syndrome, and they undergo germline testing for the gene or genes underlying that syndrome. In GI cancers, that's often been triggered by somatic findings, such as the finding of microsatellite instability or mismatch repair deficiency as a flag for Lynch syndrome. And of course, what we've seen over the recent years is as testing has become quicker, cheaper, easier through next generation sequencing, we now have the availability of these multi-gene panels. And with the availability of these panels has come a number of studies looking at the pretty simple but important question of, well, what happens when you start expanding the use of these panels further and wider? Maybe not surprisingly, but the more you look, the more you find. We've seen this in pretty much every cancer imaginable, including colorectal cancer, pancreatic cancer, and other gastrointestinal cancers, that as you do panel testing in a wider and wider swath of individuals, you find the things you might have expected to find, but you also find a lot more above and beyond what you would have expected, raising questions about what genetic variants truly cause and predispose to what, but also raising the question of how do we start using these in day-to-day practice if we're recognizing that there's more that we're missing. So current national guidelines recommend testing for all individuals with pancreatic cancer, and at least within colorectal cancer, the NCCN recently updated their guidelines to say, consider testing for all individuals, which I'm sure is a topic we'll get into.
Thanks, Matt. Great introduction already. Heather, I wonder if you could actually take us back a little earlier. You, like me, have been in this field a long time. Remind us, what was life like before panels? And this will kind of lay some fodder for the advantages of where we are today in 2020.
It's really pretty remarkable where we've come in the last 25 years. So I remember in the mid 90s when APC testing was done by protein truncation testing only, and you would get a segment 2 truncation. They still show up in people's clinics actually from time to time with new descendants who need predictive testing, and you really can't do anything with it anymore, right? You've got to repeat the testing and find the actual mutation now so that you can do a better job with cascade testing in the family. Lynch syndrome testing was only available in the mid 90s at one lab, and it required like 4 10cc tubes of blood, and you could only get MLH1 and MSH2. And this, of course, was before large rearrangement testing. This was before EpCAM. 3' deletions had even been discovered, and nobody could even touch MSH6 or PMS2. And PMS2, of course, took many years because of the pseudogenes. Really, I think back in the mid 90s, the best testing available was really for the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, and all of our colorectal cancer genes have sort of come behind those. The advent of multi-gene panel testing, I'd say I usually put on the timeline around 2013. And that's about the same time that the patents on BRCA1 and 2 were overturned, which allowed a lot of commercial labs to enter this space and to offer multi-gene panel testing at a lower cost, more genes for less cost, which has really changed everything, right? We would have never considered testing everyone back when it was Sanger sequencing one gene at a time and thousands of dollars for the test. Now we're talking about multiple genes done at the same time and hundreds of dollars for the test. And so it's really changed everything and opened up possibilities for our patients, I think, in ways we maybe didn't even imagine back then.
Thanks. No, I completely agree with you. It was a revolution to be practicing in the field at that time. Matt, I wonder if you can give us a little background on sort of a more recent revolution. You, like me, are a medical oncologist, and we have seen the introduction of tumor testing in the somatic setting, but then also the germline lurking there. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit of how things have changed in that sense, because that also impacts some of what we're doing here.
So I would argue that the first type of somatic testing in colorectal cancer has been microsatellite instability and mismatch repair deficiency, which for the longest time was really used only to screen for Lynch syndrome, thanks to Heather's pioneering work and some of her studies at Ohio State. But I think in the oncology world, that sort of somatic testing really was at best an afterthought up until recently. Nowadays, as it relates to microsatellite instability and mismatch repair deficiency, we know that those are powerful predictive factors for understanding individuals who are going to benefit from immune checkpoint inhibitor therapy, not just in colorectal cancer, but in cancers across the board, at least in the metastatic setting, though we're now getting more and more data about earlier stage settings as well. And I think that story is still being written. Above and beyond that, somatic testing nowadays really should be considered standard of care for all individuals with an advanced GI malignancy, including colorectal cancer. KRAS mutations in colorectal cancer significantly predict for absence of benefit from anti-EGFR therapies. And now we're increasingly seeing new agents coming down the pipeline that might be targetable to go after KRAS mutations. BRAF mutations, which we essentially don't see in Lynch syndrome. Likewise, we've got therapeutic agents that can target those. HER2 amplification, NTRK rearrangements. Once you start adding up a lot of these somatic alterations, it's a larger and larger fraction of the pie where that somatic testing can influence somebody's treatment, especially in the advanced setting, but in many cases now in earlier stage settings. And in order to understand the somatic tumor testing, it's often helpful to have the germline in parallel, to subtract out any variants that you might be finding that might not be of therapeutic relevance. But of course, as it relates to the work that a lot of us do, to understand if there could be underlying hereditary predisposition for that individual and for their family.
Thanks, Matt. So I think I heard Matt say there that testing all colon tumors, if it not already standard of care, will one day be. And I think this influences some of our debate. Heather, you wrote a really nice paper a couple of years back. You write a nice paper every year, if not multiple. But you wrote a nice paper about testing the tumor and how the tumor is potentially the new germline in a way. And I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on some of what Matt said about the hereditary risks of somatic testing of tumors and what we've learned from the literature there.
I think that you can glean a lot of information about germline mutation status from tumor testing, but it definitely varies from test to test. Some of the laboratories do normal and tumor at the same time. Those are the laboratories that are well positioned to give you information about germline results. Others are doing tumor only, which makes it a little more challenging to comment fully on the germline status of the patient. I think that the best recent paper we have on this topic comes from our friends at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where they found that they would have missed 20% of germline mutations in the mismatch repair genes had they done tumor-only sequencing. And that's primarily because these are genes that are known to have large preponderance of large rearrangements. In fact, 30% of mutations in MSH2 and over 30% of mutations in PMS2 are large rearrangements, which the somatic tests are really just not designed to detect. And so as much as I had hoped somatic testing could replace germline testing, and in some cases I think it can, I think a negative somatic test does not rule out a hereditary cancer syndrome. And so there's still a place for both tests. And figuring out sort of the exact way to use these tests together may be our next challenge.
So that's great. So I think I heard Heather say in there that there probably is always going to be a decision-making between the tumor test and potentially sort of full germline analysis, because there's going to be limitations of somatic. So that, again, plays into our debate here that we're not just getting all the answers already from our tumor testing. So I really appreciate the help in introducing sort of the field where we are from both of our guests today. So I'm going to just tell the audience how we're going to conduct this debate today. Again, this is a build off of point-counterpoint debate that Dr. Yurgelun and Heather Hampel first introduced to us at CGA, I think a couple of years ago. I think they've done it again live, maybe one other time, but then wrote a paper also for anyone listening if you want to get this in excruciating detail in JCO. It's very well written and provides lots of information. It was in volume 40, issue 24, for those of you who want to do some more homework in this area. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to read a statement. We're going to flip the order back and forth of who gets to respond first. They're going to get a minute. There's going to be a 1-minute rebuttal from the other guest. And then the person who went first is going to get a final 10 seconds if they want to make that final few-word jab before we move on to the next statement. So I've prepared a few of these statements so that our debaters can comment on these. And so I think without further ado, we'll get started. So this first statement, Heather Hampel is going to be our debater who gets to respond first. Again, she's going to get a minute, and I'm going to keep time, and I'm going to make a hand motion, Heather, when we're getting close to time. Then Matt will get a minute to respond and make his points, and then Heather will get a final 10 seconds if she wants them after that. All right, so let's get started. Our first statement is, expanding testing to all GI cancer patients will broaden the detection of patients with actionable mutations. Heather, go.
I feel that expanding multi-gene panel testing to all colorectal cancer patients will broaden the detection of patients with actionable mutations for a few reasons. One is we know that, at least in some of our studies of universal tumor screening, that had we restricted that to just patients under age 50, we would have missed more than half of the patients who had Lynch syndrome. So age is not always our best predictor of who's going to test positive for these hereditary cancer syndromes. I also think that doing universal tumor screening does a very good job of picking up the patients with Lynch syndrome, but it is not designed in any way to pick up the patients who have mutations in other cancer susceptibility genes. And so that was a gap for our patients over age 50 who did get, hopefully, universal tumor screening, but that would miss mutations in other cancer susceptibility genes. I think in general, we have some data that the criteria, the family history criteria, don't work very well. And that patients who meet criteria who have colon cancer, 10% will test positive, but patients who don't meet criteria who have colon cancer, still 8% test positive.
Great. Matt, your comment to that.
So I would emphasize that the question at hand is specifically, is it time to be testing everybody? Because sure, expanding testing to all colorectal cancer patients, you'll find more. But you can take that even further. If you test everybody in the general population, you're going to find more. The question is it time, and really, are we ready? And I just want to emphasize what a massive paradigm shift this would be. There's 150,000 new colorectal cancer cases in the United States every year. And by back of the envelope calculation, about 45% of them already meet criteria for germline testing. So if we're talking about testing that other 55%, it's about 85,000 additional cases, all over age 50, all mismatch repair proficient without any other high-risk features. If you look at what's actually found in those 8 to 10%, the ones who don't meet criteria, and what the actionability of these variants are, we're talking about things that are pretty minimally actionable. We're talking about monoallelic mut-YH. We're talking about I1307K. We're talking about low penetrance CHEK2, overwhelmingly so. Not exclusively so, but overwhelmingly so. And on top of that, we're talking about a whole lot of people who test negative and who have variants of uncertain significance. So we need to be thoughtful about whether we're really prepared to do this.
Great. Heather, any final statements on that?
I will agree that I think that the biggest thing that has been holding this back from being implemented in practice is logistics and preparation to handle the sheer number of patients. And that is going to be a challenge.
Great. So I'll summarize in saying, I think we all agree that there could be some great benefits here, but we all question, are we really prepared and is it the right time? Statement number 2, expanding testing to all colorectal cancer patients will improve their treatment, their lives, and the lives of their families. Matt, you get to start.
So here's where I would contrast the question of testing all colorectal cancer patients with the question of testing all pancreatic cancer patients. I would argue that testing all pancreatic cancer patients, you can change their treatments. There are FDA-approved therapies now for pancreatic cancer cases with germline alterations in BRCA1 and 2, and that list is growing. Additionally, the variants that you find there, for the most part, are actually quite actionable. BRCA1 and 2, Lynch syndrome, ATM, things where there are non-pancreatic cancer implications for those individuals themselves and, just as importantly, for their families. For colorectal cancer patients, again, if we're expanding above and beyond the people who already meet criteria for testing, the yield is incredibly small. I don't think we're doing that good of a job necessarily in getting the people in who need to be tested already in the setting of pancreatic cancer, in the setting of ovarian cancer to begin with. And so I think the incremental gain of testing these low-risk colorectal cancer patients ends up actually being relatively small.
Great. Heather, your response to that?
So I think that the two of you have convinced me that this won't be improving treatment for colorectal cancer patients anytime soon. However, I think that the second part of the question about improving their lives and the lives of their family members is the one that we have to focus on here. These patients may survive their first colon cancer and be at high risk for second primary cancers that we could potentially prevent or catch earlier if we diagnose that hereditary cancer syndrome in them. But really where most of the benefit comes, and this is where cost effectiveness analyses ended up coming out ahead for universal tumor screening, is in the family members, right? So this really becomes a question of, can we do enough cascade testing in at-risk family members to identify enough unaffected at-risk individuals who we can keep from even getting the first cancer to offset the cost of doing this for all of the colorectal cancer patients? And if so, I think it will have a benefit.
Matt, your last 10 seconds.
Yeah, I would agree that from a therapeutic standpoint right now, germline factors don't factor into somebody's colorectal cancer treatment. Somatic factors do. And it may be that this changes over time. But again, the question is it time? Are we ready? And I would argue that the yield is small enough that we've got other places we should focus first.
So if I could summarize, Matt stresses that the treatment impact in oncology, and I'll admit I have had this discussion with Heather, is pretty small in colon cancer. But Heather makes the point that there is impact way beyond the patient that is certainly beneficial. Great answers. All right, statement number 3. On a back of the envelope calculation, expanding testing will be excessively costly for society. Heather, you start.
So I have been a co-author on several of the cost effectiveness analysis papers in which universal germline testing was dominated by other approaches. Usually universal IHC for the MMR mutations, followed by MLH1 methylation testing or BRAF testing for those absent MLH1 and PMS2 wins. However, those cost effectiveness analyses were done before genetic testing, germline genetic testing costs dropped to the level that they're at now. So I think that they need repeated. And I think that there actually is another fine point that we have to consider here that hasn't been considered. And that is that if we did universal germline testing for all colorectal cancer patients, we would no longer need MSI or IHC for the stage 1, stage 2 colorectal cancer patients. We would only need it for 3 and 4s where we're making a treatment decision. And so you can remove those costs as well by adding the universal germline testing. And so it's a complicated cost effectiveness analysis that needs to be done using current prices and considering how this will affect the IHC MSI approach.
Great. Matt, your rebuttal to that.
So I actually tend to agree that I think the price tag for the testing itself is actually not a massive barrier here. Although the cost effectiveness is going to be highly dependent on getting people in for cascade testing when something is found. And that's something that the field remains particularly poor at doing. But I think where the costs come in are the downstream costs of finding something for which we maybe have relatively minimal guidance about how family members should be screened and should be counseled. We have a relatively under-equipped workforce in healthcare interpreting and understanding these. And we also have a healthcare system that probably errs on the side of over-screening, over-surgerizing, and over-treating people who have minimal degrees of increased risk. So I worry that the costs are going to come in really in the downstream aspect of this. And just to Heather's last point, that universal germline testing would allow us to forego the tumor testing in stage 1 and 2 cancers. Well, it's true that at the same time, I think that's a relatively small drop in the bucket. And for the later stage patients to begin with, they're going to be getting the same information on somatic sequencing of their tumor anyways.
Great. Heather, any final responses to that?
I would just agree that downstream costs need to be taken into consideration. And I think this is one of the concerns people have had with this recommendation is the potential mismanagement or overmanagement, particularly of variants of uncertain significance, but also low penetrance gene mutations that maybe at centers that don't have expertise in cancer genetics could be managed improperly and patients could be overscreened. And that can be costly to the healthcare system and detrimental to patients.
I think you both made a lot of great points. And I think to summarize, I think we can all acknowledge that the points Heather made, that we need to update some of these cost effectiveness analyses. There's no question that the sequencing the germline has come down. And so in many ways, it's probably that initial point of care is much less expensive than it used to be. But I think that Matt made some great points that there are a lot of hidden costs down the line. And particularly, I think the point Matt made that was also brought up by Heather is that the cascading is where you save the money. The more cascading that happens, the less expensive it is. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about how much of that happens. Okay, we'll get to our next point, and that one goes to Matt. Let's face it, all colorectal cancer patients will be getting tumor testing in the near future anyway. So why not just test the germline?
So I think that the germline can be a helpful way to follow up any worrisome findings on somatic testing, such as microsatellite instability, the incidentally identified BRCA variant, et cetera. I think the problem here is, first of all, that if we're talking about germline testing for all colorectal cancer patients, we really have to include the survivors in there too. And these types of discussions often don't take into account that there are literally millions of colorectal cancer survivors out there who are not getting somatically tested because there aren't any treatment decisions to be made. But that really amplifies the magnitude of what we're talking about here. So as I mentioned before, we're talking about 85,000 incident colorectal cancer cases per year who currently don't meet criteria for germline testing, which, by the way, already dwarfs the number of pancreatic and ovarian cancer cases combined per year. But then you add in the millions of survivors there as well. I think that tumor testing is incredibly important for people with later stage disease, and interpreting the two in concert can often have benefits. But to me, that's not necessarily a rationale for expanding the testing to everybody.
Great. Heather, what are your thoughts?
I think that I mentioned in our background section, my main concern with using somatic testing in lieu of germline testing, and that is primarily that it will not detect all of the germline mutations. And so a normal test can't be considered to rule out hereditary cancer syndromes, particularly in genes that have a large number of large rearrangements. To Dr. Yurgelun's point, I think that there is an issue with the large number of patients out there. I do view this more as a prospective change in guidelines that would be in the way we handle newly diagnosed colorectal cancer patients. I admit you will have patients come into your clinic with past diagnosis who are now eligible for testing. And we may catch a lot of them actually in their unaffected relatives who by family history would now meet criteria for testing. But I think that our efforts would be focused on the newly diagnosed patients and using new techniques like mainstreaming genetic testing to make sure that this can be done despite the large number of patients.
Great. Matt, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to emphasize the survivorship piece, I mean, it's something that the field kind of hasn't tackled yet. So much of the approaches to universal germline testing for cancer X have unfortunately focused on cancers where the survivorship pool is exceedingly small: pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, metastatic prostate cancer. And so I think that's where this is really a major paradigm shift.
So if I could summarize again, both great arguments. Matt stresses sort of the volumes of patients out there and our ability to manage all that business. He also stresses the relevance potentially of the germline to all of those patients and whether that's questionable. Heather makes strong points that certainly trying to test everyone out there, all prevalent cases could be really challenging. But if we sort of tackled this prospectively moving forward and use some newer techniques that may allow us to move people through the system faster, where there's a will, there's a way. We could probably find a way to do this. And I think those are both great points. Okay, Heather, this next one's yours. We already have a robust cancer genetics workforce in place. So what are we waiting for?
So I think Dr. Yurgelun will probably question whether we have a robust cancer genetics workforce in place. But I think we can work smarter and leaner and maximize the effectiveness of the teams that we do have in place. And so I think this is going to, by definition, necessitate a new approach to cancer genetics that will not use the traditional pre-test genetic counseling model where we spend a whole hour with a patient going through the pros and cons of testing before ordering the test. We will have to mainstream the testing to the oncology practices or the surgical clinics so that this will be offered at the point of service at the time of diagnosis, and we'll get not a full pre-test counseling, but just enough to get informed consent. Videos can be used, kiosks have been used. People are trying very creative ways of maximizing the number of patients who can get into the funnel at the top end. And then we'll reserve our precious, highly trained genetics workforce to see the positive patients who have pathogenic variants or likely pathogenic variants in cancer susceptibility genes, or those who test negative or have a variant of uncertain significance who have a strong family history.
Great points. Matt, your thoughts?
So I love our cancer genetics workforce, but I think that there is a huge fraction of the population who doesn't currently have access to that robust cancer genetics workforce, whether it's for geographic factors, socioeconomic factors. Telemedicine is breaking a little bit of this down, but not nearly enough. But to be honest, it's the non-cancer genetics workforce that I think poses the bigger concern and question. And there are data out there that non-genetic specialists, including oncologists, really don't have a high level of comfort with interpreting and counseling on germline findings. A lot of the heavy lifting here is really going to be managed by oncologists, gastroenterologists, primary care providers, at understanding who needs cascade testing. For somebody who's tested positive, what's the appropriate screening and prevention? And our cancer genetics workforce is phenomenal, but stretched thin, and also just hyper concentrated in areas that probably contribute to disparities right now, or that do contribute to disparities, I would say. And so I think that we've got a large amount of work to do to ensure that our non-cancer genetics specialists are up to the task and have the adequate resources to counsel and manage individuals.
Great answer. Heather, last thoughts on that?
I would just reinforce that COVID-19 taught us one thing, and that is taught us a lot of things. But one silver lining was that cancer genetics can be effectively conducted by televideo medicine. There are numerous companies now out there providing televideo genetic counseling services that patients who don't have local access to these services can benefit from. But again, I would agree that educating community physicians about even the availability of those services is kind of a key component of making sure patients have access.
Wonderful. I think that you both made some great points. I'll summarize by saying Heather sees the glass half full. She acknowledged we do have some limitations to the workforce, but we have lots of research and we have 2 years of, whether wanted or not, education from the pandemic to show us that we can modify and innovate and deliver services in a new and potentially better way. However, Matt, who saw the glass somewhat less full, feels there are barriers out there. And those barriers include the major barrier of access to a lot of patients who don't sit near a comprehensive cancer center or a genetic counselor, and also barriers of the non-genetics workforce, those being some of our colleagues and others who really have relatively limited education in this area, but yet more and more genetics is falling in their laps. Okay, we have one last statement. This has been really fun so far, but we'll hit our last statement. And Matt Yurgelun answers this one first. All right, our last statement is expanding genetic testing to all colorectal cancer patients will reduce cancer disparities and genetic testing disparities.
So I think the disparities question is a really interesting one here. And I think there's arguments to be made in both directions. And I think it's hard to say really which way it will pan out. As I imagine Heather might argue, if you simplify the criteria for germline testing, you break down some barriers that probably exist right now and contribute to the existing disparities. At the same time, with pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, and other cancers where the guidelines have been changed, I don't know that we're necessarily seeing the same uptick in minority populations, low socioeconomic populations that historically have not had as much uptake of germline testing. I think that there are still existing disparities there. So it's more than just changing the guidelines. And there's a huge issue here as it relates to variants of uncertain significance. Because of the existing disparities in who gets germline testing right now, there's disparities on the results end of things. Underrepresented minorities are disproportionately likely to have variants of uncertain significance instead of pathogenic variants or benign variants for that matter. And on top of that, we have data that a small but non-trivial fraction of people get mismanaged when they have a VUS. And so there's a real risk of harm here, and that risk being disproportionately borne by those who are already suffering from disparities in care.
Good points. Heather, what do you think?
So I'm convinced that universal germline testing would increase access and reduce disparities to getting patients tested. What I'm not convinced of is that we're not pushing the disparity problem downstream. So universal tumor screening for Lynch syndrome should have done the same thing, right? Because everybody's tumor gets screened regardless of socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, anything, which should have gotten more patients identified who then needed referral to genetics for genetic counseling and testing. But the nice work out of Sonia Kupfer and Charlie Mueller's group was that, unfortunately, non-Hispanic white patients are much more likely to get referred for that follow-up genetic counseling and testing with an abnormal tumor screen than other racial and ethnic groups. And I think it was worse in more community hospitals with lower SES. So I do think that this needs to be done responsibly. And I think there needs to be an element of patient navigation to make sure people don't fall through the cracks after they test positive for a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant in a cancer susceptibility gene. And that's going to take some workforce and resources to do adequately. But I don't think sites should rule this out unless they're actually prepared to handle this from front end to back end and make sure that they're not just creating more problems than they're solving.
Great. And Matt, any last words on this?
I think just to piggyback on top of that a little bit, as it relates to the variant of uncertain significance problem, because those are findings that are going to be disproportionately found in minority populations, it's incredibly important that we have systems in place for recontact, which the larger you build the scale, the more complex that needs to be. And as far as people falling through the cracks, I think the sad reality is that the people who have historically fallen through the cracks are going to be the people most likely to fall through the cracks as we do more and more and more. And so we need to be really thoughtful about this.
Great. Both again made some great points. I'll summarize in saying that I think we've all acknowledged that perhaps we can increase that upfront access with universal approaches. However, Matt stresses and Heather openly acknowledge that that's only the beginning. Matt is concerned about the VUS that are going to be found at that testing, especially in underserved populations, and then some of the uncertainty that's going to be transmitted to those patients related to what they do with that information and the difficulties of communicating that information. Heather also acknowledges that there probably going to be an increase in access, but we're going to need to be careful about which centers take on that responsibility and making sure they have the appropriate navigation and other resources in place to help these underserved populations who are getting this challenging information make good health decisions and have better outcomes down the line. I thought we would have just a few minutes for if anyone wants to make some last points that perhaps you didn't feel like you got to make under the statements that I made. Heather, we could start with you. I'll give you a minute for any final slam dunk words if you have any.
I don't know if I have any final slam dunk words, but I think that the more that Dr. Yurgelun and I debate this, the more we tend to agree with each other, and that this is something that we think is coming. And I think you two both mentioned just where and when are the remaining questions. And I think that the thing we'd like to stress here is that a lot of thought has to go into the decision about whether to offer universal germline testing to all of your colorectal cancer patients on a center by center basis, to make sure that you're prepared to get the patients consented well up front, tested appropriately, follow up for positives and negatives who have strong family histories, so that we don't end up making things worse while we're trying to make things better.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Matt, what do you have to say?
I think I would more or less echo that. I think it's okay for us to say that the time is coming, but that we might not be totally ready for it yet. And that there might be things that we need to figure out still for such a massive paradigm shift. If we're talking about further flooding the system with a lot of admittedly low risk people who are getting germline testing, it's an incredibly important opportunity for us to take a step back, be thoughtful about how we can improve the care for everybody, improve our own workflows, improve how we interpret variants and how we communicate that information to people, and really just improve the system rather than just saying, okay, these prevalence estimates say it's above a certain threshold, test everybody. It's more than just the prevalence. We need to dig down deep into what we're finding, but more importantly, how do we actually deliver that care in a way that improves the outcomes and the care for our patients and their families?
Wonderful. I think what this conversation proves is that thoughtful debating among people who are intelligent and respectful of each other can actually bring us together, can actually move us towards common values and common ways of looking at a problem, rather than what we're seeing in the current political environment in this country and around the world, which is that people are closing their ears and it's moving them even farther apart. So I want to just take a moment again and thank Heather Hampel again, our 2018 CGA president, and just an incredible colleague and friend who is always teaching me something new along the way. And Matt Yurgelun, our 2020 CGA president, who has just been a delight to work with over the years. And it's great to have another oncologist in CGA to bemoan the challenges of oncology and hereditary risk. Again, thank you both for taking the time out, and that'll conclude our debate.
Thank you.
Thank you.